As you approach the door, which is made of vertical pine planks held together by two horizontal battens and fitted with a simple iron latch, you notice that the wood has worn smooth around the handle from years of daily use. The latch lifts without resistance, and the door swings inward with only a soft whisper of its lower edge brushing the sand that has drifted against the threshold. Inside, the air is still and carries a scent that you cannot name all at once, though you can pick out the separate threads if you breathe slowly. Old timber that has dried and cured over many seasons, a faint salty tang carried in from the harbor, and beneath those, a deeper, heavier note, something faddy and marine, like the memory of a whale lingering in the very walls. The shed is a single room, perhaps 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a peaked ceiling supported by exposed rafters from which a few cobwebs hang motionless in the dimness. The floor is made of wide oak planks that have been oiled and swept so often they gleam dully, even in the low light, and everything inside has been placed with a quiet sense of order. To your left, against the wall, stands a large copper kettle on a low iron stand, its surface reflecting the grey morning in a blurred, distorted circle. Next to it sits a collection of shallow tin pans, stacked neatly in diminishing sizes, like a family of metal dishes. Farther along the same wall, a row of wooden pegs holds lengths of clean muslin cloth, squares of wool felt cut to precise dimensions, and several glass rods of different thicknesses. On the opposite side of the shed, beneath a window fitted with an extra pane to admit as much light as possible, stretches a long workbench of pine, its surface covered with earthenware jars of fuller's earth, brass funnels, a pair of copper ladles, a sand glass, and a small wooden box that contains braided cotton wicks. In the center of the room, with plenty of space around it, stands a small iron stove, unlit at this hour, its door closed and its chimney pipe heading straight up through the roof. At the far end of the shed, beyond the stove, several oak barrels rest on their sides in a wooden cradle, their staves held tight by iron hoops and their bungs sealed with a thin layer of pale wax. You see a figure enter behind you, a man in plain work clothes made of heavy brown cotton, a collarless shirt, a dark wool waistcoat that has lost all but one of its original buttons, and trousers tucked into low boots softened by age and oil. He wears no hat, and his hair is the color of sand mixed with a little ash, cut short enough to stay out of his eyes. He moves without hurry, his hands hanging loose at his sides as he pauses just inside the doorway and lets his gaze travel across the shed with the familiarity of someone who has seen this same arrangement hundreds of times before. He is the whale oil refiner, and his work is not to hunt the great animals or to boil their blubber down into the crude, smoky liquid that arrives in casks, but to take that dark, heavy oil and turn it into something so pure and clear that it will burn without a flicker or a speck of soot for hours upon hours, first in the great lenses of lighthouses and then in the street lamps of distant cities. Nothing about him suggests urgency or excitement, only a settled attention that seems to match the grey quiet of the morning. The refiner's first act, after closing the door gently behind him, is to cross to the eastern wall and open the wide wooden shutter that covers the single window overlooking the harbor. The shutter is held closed by a simple hook and eye, and when he releases it and swings the shutter outward, a soft flood of grey light enters the shed, revealing the grain of every board and the faint dust motes that drift in the still air. Outside, the fog still wraps the water, so that the harbor appears as a flat silver sheet without a visible horizon, and the masts of the fishing boats rise out of the whiteness like thin reeds. The refiner does not pause to admire the view in the way a visitor might, but he does stand for a moment with his hand resting on the windowsill, feeling the cool air on his face and letting his breathing settle into a slow, even rhythm. Lenny turns back into the room and begins the small, careful sequence of tasks that will prepare the shed for the long day ahead. He picks up the broom that leans in the corner by the door, a simple implement with a wooden handle worn to a smooth polish at the grip, and bristles made of bound straw. Starting at the far end of the shed, near the barrels, he begins to sweep the floor in long, unhurried strokes that move the dust and the occasional stray fiber of felt toward the open doorway. The sound of the broom against the oak planks is soft and rhythmic, a whisper that rises and falls with each pass, and he works his way across the entire floor without missing a single corner, even ducking his head to sweep under the workbench and around the legs of the stove. When he has gathered a small pile of debris just outside the threshold, he leans the broom against the wall and bends to collect the sweepings with a flat tin dustpan, carrying them to a small bucket that sits beside the doorpost. The floor now looks clean and ready, its dark planks absorbing the morning light in a way that makes the whole room feel settled. Next, the refiner turns his attention to the workbench, moving along its length and checking each item with the light touch of someone who knows exactly where everything belongs. He picks up one of the glass rods and holds it to the window, looking for any smudge or crack, before replacing it gently in its groove on a wooden tray. He lifts the lid of the small wick box and counts the braided cotton strands inside, though he does not seem to be making a mental note, so much as confirming a fact he already knows. He runs a finger around the rim of a brass funnel, feels a slight roughness, and sets it aside to be polished later with a scrap of fine cloth. Everything else appears to satisfy him, and he takes a soft rag from a drawer beneath the bench and wipes the surface of the pine, moving in slow circles that erase the faint watermark left by yesterday's work. The rag leaves behind a clean, dry scent that mingles with the maritime heaviness of the oil residues still sealed inside their jars and casks. Now the refiner walks to the stove, which stands in the center of the shed like a squat black guardian. He unlatches the small iron door and peers inside, checking that the ash pan has been emptied and that the grate is clear of clinkers. A small basket of kindling sits beside the stove, filled with dried bits of wood no thicker than a thumb and a few twists of straw used as tinder. The refiner selects a handful of the driest straw and places it inside the stove's belly, arranging it loosely so that air can circulate underneath. On top of this, he lays 3 of the thinnest sticks, crossing them in a simple lattice, and then he adds 2 slightly thicker pieces of split pine that will catch the first heat and burn long enough to warm the iron. He reaches for the flint and steel that sit on a small shelf above the stove, their surfaces darkened by use, and he strikes them together with a practiced, unhurried motion. A small spark jumps onto the straw, and after a few quiet puffs of his breath, a tiny orange flame appears, curling upward like a waking plant. The flame spreads to the kindling, and soon the stove begins to emit a low, steady crackle that is the only active sound in the shed. The refiner closes the stove door, leaving the draft vent slightly open, and the warmth begins to seep outward, loosening the chill that had settled into the corners of the room overnight. With the fire established, the refiner moves to the collection of earthenware jars on the bench and unscrews the lid of the largest one, which contains a fine grey powder known as Fuller's Earth. He spoons a small amount onto a sheet of clean paper and examines its texture, rubbing a pinch between his thumb and forefinger to check for any moisture that might have crept in from the damp island air. The powder feels dry and silky, and he tips it carefully back into the jar before replacing the lid with a quarter turn of his wrist. He repeats this inspection with the crushed charcoal stored in a smaller jar, finding it perfectly dry. Then he lifts a square of wool felt from the peg on the wall and holds it up to the window light, looking for any thin spots or tears that would allow coarse particles to pass through. The felt is thick and even, its fibers matted together into a dense pad that has been cut precisely to fit the tin funnel it will later line. Satisfied, he returns it to its peg and takes down a length of muslin instead, shaking it out so that it floats for a moment before settling into a soft white rectangle. He folds the muslin into quarters and places it on the bench beside the funnel, ready for the later stages of filtration. Throughout these preparations, the shed has been gradually warming, and the sharp edge of the early morning chill has softened into something more comfortable. The light through the window has brightened just a little, shifting from a dull grey to a grey tinged with the faintest hint of yellow, as if the sun is trying to press through the fog without yet succeeding. The refiner moves to the copper kettle and removes its heavy lid, setting it aside on the iron stand. He takes a clean rag and wipes the interior of the kettle, even though it was cleaned thoroughly the evening before, and covered overnight with a cloth. The motion is slow and circular, and when he withdraws the rag it shows not a single smudge of darkness. He places the lid back loosely and then turns to the shallow tin pans, which he also wipes down, one by one, until their brushed metal surfaces gleam with a soft, diffuse light that seems to hold the promise of the bleaching work to come. Outside, the first sounds of the waking waterfront begin to reach the shed. The distant cry of a gull, the wooden creak of a boat rubbing against a piling, the muffled thud of cargo being shifted somewhere along the wharf. These noises drift in through the open window as if they belong to a different world, a world that moves faster and with more purpose, while inside the shed everything remains suspended in a gentle, unhurried stillness. The refiner does not appear to notice the sounds, or if he does, he accepts them the way a tree accepts the passing wind, without reaction or comment. He finishes arranging the pans and then stands back, his hands resting on the edge of the workbench, and for several minutes he simply looks at the room he has prepared. There is no tension in his shoulders and no restlessness in his posture, only a quiet readiness that seems to fill the space like the warmth from the stove. The copper kettle, the tin pans, the felt pads, the muslin squares, the jars of earth and charcoal, the glass rods, the sand glass, the wicks, the funnels, the ladles, the barrels in their cradle, all of them wait in their appointed places, each object holding within itself a single small role in the long chain of transformation that will soon begin. The shed itself seems to hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in a state of simple, patient being. The planks of the walls have absorbed the smell of oil so deeply that they no longer seem like wood, but like a porous archive of all the previous batches that have passed through this room, batch after batch, year after year, each one leaving behind a ghost of its presence that mingles with the ghosts of all the others. The floor, too, carries the memory of countless footsteps, the same path from door to stove to bench to window, worn into the oak by a man who has never felt the need to hurry. And you, standing somewhere near the door with the cool air still eddying around your ankles, begin to feel the pull of that same stillness, the way the shed's quietness invites you to let go of whatever small urgencies you might have carried in with you. The refiner has not spoken a single word, has not acknowledged your presence in any overt way, yet his calm seems to extend outward and wrap itself around you like the warmth from the stove. You find your breathing slowing, your gaze softening as you watch him take a small wooden stool from beneath the bench and set it near the window, where the light is strongest. He sits down, folds his hands in his lap, and closes his eyes for a moment, not sleeping, but resting in the way that a cat rests, alert even in stillness. The fire crackles softly in the stove, the gull cries once more and then falls silent, and the shed settles into the long, peaceful quiet that will hold it until the wagon arrives with the first cask of crude oil and the real work of the day commences. But for now, in this early hour, when the light is still grey and tentative, there is nothing to do but wait, and the waiting itself feels like a kind of work. The kind that asks only for your presence and your patience, nothing more. The quiet inside the shed had stretched on for perhaps an hour, measured only by the slow migration of the grey light across the pine floorboards and the occasional soft settling of the fire in the stove, when a new sound began to form at the edge of hearing. It was a low wooden groan, the kind of noise made by a heavy cart moving slowly over rutted sand with its wheels turning against the resistance of the earth. The refiner, who had remained seated on his stool with his eyes half closed and his breathing as steady as the tide, opened his eyes fully but did not rise, only tilted his head a fraction toward the open window as if to confirm what he already knew. The sound grew closer, resolving into the distinct creak of axles, the muffled thud of hoofs pressing into damp ground, and the occasional jingle of a harness buckle, and soon the cart itself came into view outside the window, a sturdy two-wheeled vehicle drawn by a single brown horse whose coat was darkened with the morning mist. Two men sat on the driver's bench, both wearing the heavy wool jackets and oiled boots of waterfront laborers, and behind them, lashed upright with thick rope, stood a single oak cask, its staves dark with age and its iron hoops showing patches of rust where the paint had worn away. The cart came to a stop just beyond the boardwalk that led to the shed door, and the horse exhaled a long breath that steamed faintly in the cool air. One of the men climbed down from the bench and stretched his arms, working the stiffness out of his shoulders after the ride from the try-works on the other side of the island, while the other remained seated and took up the slack in the reins. The refiner rose from his stool at last, his movement unhurried and fluid, and crossed to the door, lifting the latch and pulling it inward to admit the full wash of the outside air. The fog had thinned enough by now that you could see the outlines of the nearer wharves and the dark shapes of barrels stacked along them, though the horizon still dissolved into a soft silver haze. The man who'd climbed down, a broad-shouldered figure with a beard that showed more grey than black, touched the brim of his cap in a gesture that was both greeting and acknowledgement, and the refiner responded with a simple nod, stepping aside so that the doorway stood fully open to the morning. The two men worked together to loosen the ropes that held the cask, their movements practiced and economical, and then they ticked it carefully onto its side and rolled it down a short plank ramp that extended from the cart bed to the packed sand. The cask was heavy. You could tell from the way the sand compressed beneath it and from the deep thrumming sound it made as it rotated, a low, hollow note that spoke of the dense liquid sealed inside. The men guided it along the boardwalk with small, careful nudges, their boots thudding on the planks, and when they reached the shed door they tilted the cask upright again and maneuvered it through the opening with the ease of long practice. The refiner indicated a spot on the floor near the workbench, away from the stove but within easy reach of the settling basin, and the men set the cask down there, its base landing on the oak planks with a solid, final thump that seemed to travel through the floorboards and up into your own feet. The bearded man wiped his forehead with his sleeve, leaving a faint smear of something dark on the cuff, and the other man, still silent, began coiling the rope they had removed. The refiner exchanged a few quiet words with them, mundane matters about the condition of the roads and the state of the tide, spoken so softly that you could not make out the individual syllables even from a few feet away. And then the men departed, the cart rolling away with the same groaning sound, the horses' hooves fading into the regular sounds of the waterfront, until they were indistinguishable from the general murmur of the morning. With the shed once again sealed against the outside, the refiner stood before the cask and looked at it with the same steady attention he had given to every other object in the room. The cask was perhaps 3 feet tall, wider at its belly than at its ends, and its wood was the colour of strong tea, with darker streaks where the grain ran in tight whorls. A wooden bung, tapered and wrapped with a strip of cloth, was driven firmly into the hole at the top of the cask, and a thin ring of paler wax sealed the gap between the bung and the stave. The refiner ran his hand over the outside of the cask, feeling for any dampness that might indicate a leak or a weakness in the wood, but his palm came away dry and clean. Then he knelt down, not with a grunt or a sigh, but with the quiet flexibility of someone who had spent his life bending and reaching, and he placed his ear close to the bulge of the cask, listening for a long moment to the deep silence within, a silence that was not empty but full, dense with the weight of the liquid that filled the container nearly to the brim. When he was satisfied that the cask had travelled without damage, the refiner rose and walked to the workbench to collect a short iron bar with a flattened, curved end, a tool designed specifically for the purpose of extracting bungs without splitting the wood around them. He also took up a clean copper ladle, the one with the longest handle and the deepest bowl, which hung from a hook on the edge of the bench by a loop of leather thong. Returning to the cask, he fitted the tip of the iron bar into the narrow gap between the bung and the stave, worked it in with a gentle rocking motion, and then applied a steady, even pressure until the bung began to rise, its cloth wrapping peeling away from the wax seal with a soft tearing sound. The bung came free with a small, wet pop, and immediately the scent that had been merely a background note in the shed for the past hour intensified into something far more present and insistent. It was a strong, oily smell, rich with the heavy marine essence of the deep ocean, carrying notes that were at once fishy and faintly sweet, like the smell of a beach at low tide on a warm day, but concentrated and bottled. The aroma rolled outward from the open bunghole in a wave that filled the shed from floor to rafters, and you found yourself breathing shallowly for a moment, until your senses adjusted to the new atmosphere. The refiner did not seem to mind the scent at all, breathing it in as if it were the ordinary air of his workshop, which in many ways it was. He leaned over the open bunghole and peered inside, though the interior of the cask was too dark to reveal much beyond a faint glimmer of liquid surface far below. Instead of relying on sight, he inserted the copper ladle slowly, letting it descend until he felt it meet the surface of the oil, and then he pushed it deeper, submerging the bowl and allowing the thick liquid to flow over its rim. When he withdrew the ladle, it came up heavy and slow, the oil clinging to the copper in a glossy coating that dripped back into the cask in long, reluctant strands. He held the ladle up to the window light, and you could see the crude whale oil for the first time in its unrefined state. It was not the clear, pale liquid that would eventually fill the lamps, but something far darker and more opaque, a deep reddish-brown color that bordered on black where the ladle was deepest. The light struggled to penetrate even the thin layer cradled in the copper bowl, and the surface showed no sparkle, only a dull, oily sheen that moved slowly when the refiner tilted the ladle from side to side. Suspended within the liquid were tiny particles, some dark and some pale, bits of what looked like ash or char, fragments of membrane that had survived the rendering fire, and a faint cloudy haze that spoke of water still emulsified within the oil. Water that would cause the lamp flame to spit and crackle if it were not removed. The crude oil was, in truth, only halfway to being useful, a raw material that still carried within it the memory of the great animal from which it had come, the blubber that had been stripped and boiled in great iron pots, the smoke and steam of the try-works, and the long, hot hours of rendering that had separated the liquid fat from the solid waste. The refiner pulled the contents of the ladle back into the cask with a slow, deliberate tilt of his wrist, watching the dark stream reunite with the larger body of oil, and then he set the ladle aside on a clean cloth he had spread on the bench for this purpose. He did not rush to begin the refining, because rushing served no purpose in this work. The oil that had just arrived was still warm from its long journey in the cask, having been poured into the container at the try-works while it was still fluid from the rendering heat. But that warmth would soon dissipate in the cool air of the shed, and as it cooled, the oil would thicken slightly, becoming more viscous and less willing to release the impurities it held. For this reason, the first stage of refinement began not with any active process, but with a period of rest. The refiner selected a wide, shallow settling basin from a stack beneath the workbench, a vessel made of heavy tin with low, sloping sides and a flat bottom that could hold perhaps 3 gallons of liquid. He placed this basin on the floor beside the cask, centering it carefully so that it stood level on the planks, and then he fetched a square of loosely woven linen from one of the pegs. He stretched the linen over the mouth of the settling basin, securing it with a length of twine tied around the rim so that the fabric formed a loose, sagging cover that would keep out dust and the occasional fly while still allowing the oil to breathe. Now came the transfer of the oil, a process that required steadiness rather than strength. The refiner lifted a clean copper pot from its shelf and placed it on the floor near the cask, then returned to the workbench for a different ladle, this one with a longer spout, designed for pouring without spilling. He dipped the ladle into the open cask, filling it once more with the dark, heavy oil, and then he poured it into the copper pot, repeating this motion again and again, each ladleful taking its time to drain, each pour sending a low, glugging sound into the quiet shed. The oil pooled in the pot, its surface sluggish and slow to settle, and as the level rose, the color deepened from a dark mahogany to something closer to a moonless night. When the pot was about 3/4 full, the refiner set the ladle down and took hold of the pot's 2 handles, lifting it with the care of someone carrying a full vessel of liquid across a swaying deck. Even though the floor of the shed was perfectly steady, P carried the pot to the settling basin and tipped it slowly, allowing the oil to flow through the linen cover and into the basin in a single, continuous stream that was as thick and dark as molasses. The linen sagged under the weight of the stream, and some of the coarsest debris, the larger fragments of char and the occasional hair or fiber, collected on its surface, already beginning the work of separation even as the basin filled. The refiner made several trips from cask to basin, each one repeating the same quiet sequence of dip, carry, pour, and return, until the settling basin held a substantial quantity of the crude oil and the cask was noticeably lighter, though far from empty. He did not empty the cask entirely, leaving the dregs at the very bottom undisturbed because the lowest portion of the oil contained the heaviest sediment, the layer that had settled during the cart ride and that would only foul the settling basin if transferred too early. That material would be dealt with later, after the main body of the oil had been cleaned. For now, the basin sat on the floor with its dark cargo, and the refiner straightened up, pressing one hand briefly to the small of his back as he surveyed the arrangement. The oil in the basin was already beginning its slow, silent work, though no change was visible yet to the eye. Gravity, that patient and tireless force, was tugging at every suspended particle within the liquid, pulling the heaviest bits downward toward the tin floor, pulling the water droplets into tiny beads that would coalesce and sink, pulling the blood and the tissue fragments and the specks of ash out of suspension and into a sludge that would collect at the bottom of the basin over the course of the afternoon. The process required no supervision, no intervention, only time, and the refiner was prepared to give it exactly that. He returned the copper pot to its place, wiped the ladle with a clean rag and hung it back on its hook, then took down the rag and wiped the outside of the cask where a few drops of oil had dribbled during the pouring. The bung hole remained open, but he covered it loosely with a piece of folded muslin to keep out any floating debris while still allowing the air to circulate. Then he walked to the stove and opened the small door, checking the fire which had burned down to a bed of glowing coals that radiated a steady, comfortable heat. He added a single split log of pine, placing it across the coals with the same careful attention he gave to everything else, and then he closed the door and adjusted the vent so that the fire would burn low and slow, maintaining the warmth without overheating the shed. The warmth was important because the oil separated more readily when it was neither too cold nor too hot, and the refiner had learned over many years exactly the range of temperature that the settling basin preferred, a range that he maintained not with a thermometer but with the back of his hand held a few inches above the surface of the oil, feeling the gentle radiant heat that rose from it. With the settling underway, the shed returned to its previous quiet, though the quality of that quiet had changed. Before the arrival of the cask, the silence had been like an empty room, waiting and open. Now it was a silence with a task in progress, the stillness of a watch being kept. The refiner returned to his stool by the window, but this time he did not close his eyes. Instead, he sat facing the settling basin, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze resting on the dark surface of the oil without any particular focus. The hours ahead would be long and uneventful, filled with small moments of maintenance and observation, and he settled into them the way a stone settles into a streambed, letting the current of time flow around him without resistance. Outside, the fog had lifted enough to reveal a pale disk of sun behind a high layer of cloud, and the light that came through the window grew a little stronger, catching the edges of the tin basin and the copper kettle and making them gleam with a soft, metallic warmth. The refiner sat, and the oil sat, and the small shed on the sandy edge of Nantucket held them both in its patient embrace, waiting for the next step in the long, slow chain of transformation. The morning had advanced enough that the light through the eastern window no longer fell in a soft, directionless wash, but had begun to angle downward in a pale shaft that struck the floorboards just beyond the settling basin, illuminating a rectangle of wood grain that seemed to glow with its own muted warmth. The refiner, who had been sitting quietly on his stool for the better part of an hour, rose with the same unhurried ease that characterized all his movements and crossed to the basin, bending at the waist to bring his eyes level with the dark surface of the oil that had been resting there. The surface had changed in subtle ways since he had poured it from the cask, and a person who did not know what to look for might have said it looked exactly the same. But the refiner saw the differences at once because he had been watching them develop in the slow, patient way that a gardener watches a bud tighten before it opens. The oil was still dark and opaque in its upper reaches, but a faint gradient had established itself, the topmost inch or two appearing slightly less turbid than the depths below, as if the liquid was beginning to sort itself into layers. At the very bottom of the basin, entirely invisible through the murk, a thin sludge was already accumulating, a mixture of blood residues, tiny bone fragments, particles of ash, and the microscopic debris that the rendering fire had failed to consume. The oil was not yet clear by any measure, but it had begun to yield to gravity, and that yielding was the signal the refiner had been waiting for. He straightened up and walked to the workbench, where the clean copper pot he intended to use as a receiving vessel sat waiting beside a stack of wall felt discs. He lifted the pot and inspected its interior, though he had scoured it himself the night before, and it was as bright as a new penny, its copper catching the window light in a warm, rosy gleam. He placed the pot on the floor, directly beneath the front edge of the bench, positioning it so that the funnel he would soon set up would drain directly into its wide mouth without a single drop straying, and then he reached for the large tin funnel that hung from its peg on the wall. The funnel was a simple object, a cone of tin hammered into shape by a Nantucket tinsmith years ago and soldered along its seam, its spout cut straight rather than angled, its rim rolled over a wire to give it strength. It had no decoration and no maker's mark, only a faint, even discoloration on its interior where countless gallons of oil had flowed through it over the years, and it felt cool and smooth in the refiner's hands as he carried it back to the bench. He placed the funnel into a wooden stand that held it upright above the copper pot, adjusting the stand's sliding collar until the funnel sat level and secure, its spout centered perfectly over the pot's opening. Then he selected one of the wool felt discs from the stack, a circle about 8 inches across and half an inch thick, cut from a large sheet of felt that had been manufactured specifically for filtration, its fibers dense and interlocked into a mat that would trap even the finest solid particles while allowing the liquid oil to pass through with only moderate resistance. He held the felt disc between both hands and flexed it gently, testing its integrity, and it bent without creaking or cracking, the fibers still supple and springy from the lanolin that had been left in the wool during its processing. Satisfied, he lowered the disc into the wide mouth of the funnel, pressing it down with his fingertips all around the rim so that it formed a concave lining that followed the cone's interior slope. The felt settled into place with a soft hiss of wool against tin, and the refiner used a wooden dowel to press the edges more firmly against the funnel wall, ensuring there were no gaps where oil could bypass the filter and run down the sides untouched. With the filtration apparatus assembled, the refiner returned to the settling basin and lifted the linen cover, folding it back over the rim so that the full surface of the oil lay exposed. The smell that rose from the basin was still strong and marine, but it had mellowed just slightly during the settling period, losing its sharpest, most volatile notes and settling into something heavier and more earthbound. He took up the long-handled ladle, the one with the pouring spout that he had used to transfer the oil earlier, and he lowered its bowls slowly into the basin, careful not to plunge too deep and stir up the sediment that had gathered at the bottom. He dipped from the upper portion of the oil, where the liquid was clearest, drawing out a ladleful of the still dark, but now marginally less turbid material, that glugged as it filled the copper bowl. Carrying the ladle with a steady hand, he walked the few steps to the funnel and tilted the spout over the center of the felt disc, allowing the oil to flow onto the wool in a thin, controlled stream. The first drop struck the felt and spread outward in a dark stain that bloomed like a flower opening, the oil sinking into the fibers and then, a moment later, beginning to seep through the underside of the disc as a slow, amber-colored seep that gathered into droplets along the lowest point of the felt and then fell into the copper pot below. The sound of the drops hitting the pot was soft and intermittent at first, a quiet plink, plink, plink that echoed gently in the still air of the shed, each drop separated from the next by a pause of 2 or 3 seconds, while the oil navigated its way through the dense wool. The refiner stood watching, the ladle still extended, as the flow established itself, the drips gradually quickening into a thin, steady trickle that produced a continuous, low music. The kind of sound that was so constant and unremarkable, it quickly became absorbed into the background of the shed, along with the rustle of the stove and the distant wash of the tide. He poured another ladleful, then another, each one following the same patient arc from basin to funnel, each one adding its volume to the felt disc that was now thoroughly saturated and dark with the captured impurities. The felt, even after only a few minutes of filtration, had begun to show the evidence of its work. The clean, pale wool that the refiner had pressed into the funnel was now stained a deep reddish brown, almost black where the oil first landed, fading to a lighter shade near the edges where the flow was slower, and across its upper surface a thin layer of debris was already accumulating. Bits of char that had been too fine to settle in the basin, fragments of membrane that looked like tiny translucent flakes, specks of what might have been sand or ash or the calcined remains of crustaceans from the whale's stomach, all of them lay trapped in the wool fibers, held fast while the oil that had been suspended continued its journey downward. The refiner paused his ladling to examine the felt, leaning close so that his face was only a few inches from the surface of the oil that now pooled in the funnel above the disc. And he saw that the flow rate had begun to slow, the oil backing up slightly behind the accumulating layer of solids. This was expected, a normal part of the filtration, and he dealt with it in the customary way by taking up a small wooden paddle, no larger than a butter knife, and using its flat edge to scrape very gently across the surface of the felt, dislodging the thickest accumulation of debris and drawing it toward the rim of the funnel where it could be scooped away. The motion was light and careful because pressing too hard would drive the debris deeper into the fibers and clog them permanently, and the refiner performed it with the same unhurried precision he brought to every task, his wrist moving in a slow, circular path that lifted the trapped particles without damaging the wool beneath. He wipes the paddle on a rag kept for this purpose, leaving a dark smear on the cloth, and then resumed ladling, dipping again from the settling basin and pouring the oil over the cleaned portion of the felt. The flow quickened immediately, the trickle from the spout thickening into a rope of liquid that splashed softly into the pot, and the refiner settled into a rhythm: ladle, pour, scrape, ladle, pour, scrape, each cycle taking perhaps 2 minutes, each cycle moving a small volume of oil from the basin to the pot, each cycle darkening the felt a little more and lightening the contents of the copper receiver by an almost imperceptible degree. He did not count the cycles or measure the time, working instead by the feel of the oil and the behavior of the filter, knowing without thinking when the felt needed attention and when the ladle needed refilling. His body tuned to the task in a way that allowed his mind to drift into that peaceful space between concentration and rest. The oil that collected in the copper pot below the funnel was noticeably different from the oil that still remained in the settling basin, though the difference was not dramatic to an untrained eye. It was still a dark amber color, still opaque when viewed through any depth greater than an inch, but the heavy cloudiness that had characterized the crude liquid was diminished, and when the refiner held a glass vial of it up to the window, the light that passed through was a clearer shade of reddish brown, like strong tea held in a thick cup. The large visible particles were gone entirely, and the smaller ones, the microscopic solids that had given the crude oil its muddy opacity, had been reduced by a significant fraction, caught in the labyrinth of wool fibers that had been designed for exactly this purpose. The smell, too, had changed, losing some of its sharper, more animal notes and becoming slightly cleaner, though it still carried a distinct marine character that would persist until the later stages of the refining. The refiner took a moment to appreciate these small transformations, holding the vial up to the light and tilting it slowly so that the oil slid from one end to the other, and then he returned the sample to the pot and continued his work. After perhaps an hour of steady ladling and scraping, the felt disc had become so thoroughly clogged with debris that even with regular scraping, the oil was passing through at a rate slower than a single drop every 5 seconds, and the pool of unfiltered oil in the funnel had risen to within an inch of the rim. The refiner recognized this as the moment to replace the felt, and he set down the ladle and the paddle with the care of someone setting down tools that belonged to a long and peaceful tradition. He lifted the spent disc from the funnel, peeling it away from the tin with a wet, sucking sound, and held it over a scrap bucket kept near the stove. The disc was heavy with oil and thick with a dark pasty sludge that coated the upper surface entirely, and as he tilted it, a slow drip of excess oil ran off and into the bucket, leaving a trail like dark honey. He dropped the spent felts into the bucket and wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his apron, then selected a fresh disc from the stack, inspected it, and pressed it into the funnel with the same careful sequence of motions he had used before. The new felts, pale and clean, accepted the next ladleful of oil with an eager thirst, and the slow plink, plink, plink of drops began again, marking the start of a new cycle in the long filtration. The shed remained quiet around him, the only changes being the gradual shift of the light as the sun climbed behind its veil of cloud, and the slow depletion of the oil in the settling basin. The refiner paused now and again to stretch his back, his hands pressing lightly against his hips as he arched gently, or to add a stick of wood to the stove, which he did with the same quiet economy he brought to everything else. You, observing from your place near the door, might have noticed how the quality of the silence had shifted again, becoming the silence of repetition and rhythm, a silence that was not empty, but filled with the soft, continuous sounds of the filter, the scrape of the paddle, the glug of the ladle, the rustle of the fire. It was the kind of silence that invited sleep, the kind that wrapped itself around you like a heavy blanket and made your eyelids grow weightier with each passing minute. and the refiner, moving through his work with his steady, unhurried pace, seemed as much a part of that silence as the rafters and the floorboards and the fog that still lingered beyond the window. The copper pot that had been receiving the filtered oil now held a quantity that was just shy of its brim, its surface a dark amber mirror that reflected the rafters and the dim shape of the refiner whenever he leaned over it. He had ladled the last of the clear upper portion from the settling basin some minutes ago, and had removed the funnel stand from its position over the pot, setting it aside on the bench where a dark ring of dripped oil had begun to stain the pine. The second felt disc, now also clogged and heavy with debris, joined its predecessor in the scrap bucket, and the tin funnel itself was wiped clean with a rag and hung back on its peg to await the next day's work. The raw oil still remaining in the bottom of the basin, thick with the sludge that gravity had drawn down, would be dealt with later, perhaps tomorrow, when the refiner would mix it with a little water and reheat it gently to release the last usable oil from the sediment. But for now it sat under its linen cover, quiet and ignored. The refiner lifted the full copper pot with both hands and carried it across the shed to the stove, where the fire had been maintained at a low, even heat, the iron top at the stove giving off a radiant warmth that could be felt a foot away. The copper kettle, which had been standing empty on its iron stand, was waiting with its heavy lid set to one side, and the refiner paused for a moment to check the interior of the kettle once more, running a clean cloth around its curved walls even though he had inspected it only that morning, the cloth coming away perfectly clean and dry. Then he tilted the pot and began to pour the filtered oil into the kettle in a slow, steady stream that caught the firelight and glowed a deep, translucent red-brown as it fell. The oil entered the kettle with a soft, pouring hush, rising up the copper sides in an even layer, and when the pot was empty, the refiner set it aside on the floor and lifted the kettle's lid back into place, the heavy copper disc settling with a quiet, definitive clink. Now the heating could begin. The refiner crouched before the stove and opened the small iron door at its base, peering in at the bed of coals that glowed a steady orange beneath the grate. He took a short iron poker and stirred the coals gently, not stabbing or jabbing but simply nudging them so that the ash fell away and the heat they radiated increased by a small, measurable amount. He added no fresh wood because the purpose now was not to build a hot fire but to maintain a gentle, even warmth, a heat that would thin the oil without driving off its more delicate properties. He adjusted the stove's vent, sliding the small iron plate so that the draft was reduced and the fire would breathe slowly, and then he straightened up and rested his palm against the side of the kettle, feeling the copper begin to absorb the warmth, the metal transitioning from cool to metal to faintly warm in a matter of minutes. The purpose of the heating was several-fold, though the refiner never articulated these purposes to himself in words. Warming the oil made it less viscous, which would encourage any remaining microscopic solids to sink faster and more completely when the settling began. It also drove off the volatile compounds that contributed to the strong marine odor, those small, energetic molecules that evaporated easily when given the slightest encouragement of warmth, and that, if left in the finished oil, would produce a faint haze and a fishy smell when the lamp was lit. And the gentle heat had a third benefit, a subtle one, which was that it prepared the oil for the bleaching process that would follow by opening up the liquid structure in some invisible way, making it more receptive to the action of the sunlight and the fuller's earth. The refiner knew all of this in the same deep, wordless way that he knew the weight of the ladle and the texture of the felt, and he brought his attention now to the task of managing the temperature with the same patient focus he had given to the filtration. He fetched a long wooden paddle from its hook on the wall, a paddle made of ash wood with a flat, rounded blade and a handle worn smooth by the grip of countless hours. Inserting the blade through the small gap he created by lifting the kettle lid just an inch, he began to stir the oil in a slow, deliberate motion, tracing a circle around the inner wall of the kettle, then a smaller circle, then a third circle, closer to the center, completing one full set before reversing direction and tracing the same circles back again. The oil moved with a heavy, languid resistance, parting around the paddle and flowing back together in a way that made no sound at all, only a silent, thick swirling that barely disturbed the surface. The refiner counted the circuit silently, not with any sense of urgency or ritual, but simply to pass the time and to ensure that every part of the oil received an equal share of his attention. 20 circuits, he had learned over the years, was enough to distribute the heat evenly and to discourage the formation of hot spots near the kettle wall where the oil might scorch and darken. And 20 circuits was what he gave it, no more and no less. When the stirring was complete, he withdrew the paddle and wiped it clean on a cloth, hanging it back on its hook, and then he laid his palm flat against the side of the kettle, feeling for the temperature. The copper was warm now, but not hot, warm enough that he could hold his hand there indefinitely without discomfort, and that was exactly the temperature he wanted. The oil inside would be perhaps a few degrees warmer than his hand, thinned to a consistency more like heavy cream than cold molasses, and the faint steam that began to rise from the small gap around the lid carried with it a sharp, fleeting note, the smell of the volatile compounds departing. The refiner lifted the lid fully for a moment and leaned over the kettle, breathing in the rising vapor and assessing its character, and he saw that the surface of the oil was now perfectly smooth and dark, with a faint shimmer of convection currents moving slowly across it, like the patterns in a rain puddle. He replaced the lid loosely, leaving a tiny gap on one side to allow the vapors to escape without letting dust fall in, and then he draped a clean square of muslin over the entire top of the kettle, tucking the edges under the lid so that the cloth formed a breathable barrier. The heating was essentially complete now, and the second phase of this stage, the long settling, was about to begin. The refiner stepped back from the stove and surveyed the shed, his eyes moving over the bench, the basin, the barrels, and the window, and finding everything in its proper place, he allowed himself to settle onto his stool with a quiet exhale that seemed to release the last of the morning's tension from his shoulders. The hours that followed belonged to the oil and not to the refiner. He sat on his stool by the window, his back resting against the wall and his hands folded loosely in his lap. And he let the time pass in the way that a person who lives alone with his work learns to do, neither fighting it nor counting it, simply accepting its slow, steady flow. The shed around him was filled with the small, comfortable sounds that had been present since the early morning. The low, almost subaudible hum of the stove, the occasional soft tick of a cooling ember, the distant, muffled rhythm of the tide moving against the sandy shore beyond the fog. To these were added the new sounds of the settling oil, sounds so faint that they registered more as a feeling than as a noise, the almost imperceptible whisper of particles sliding downward through the warm liquid, the tiny wet click of a water droplet joining its fellows at the bottom of the kettle. The refiner's eyes grew heavy, not with sleep exactly, but with a kind of deep, dreamy restfulness, and he allowed them to close, his breathing slowing to match the pace of the oil's own patient transformation. In the quiet, you could observe the shed itself, as if it were a living thing, a creature of wood and iron and copper that breathed through the stove, and saw through the window and remembered through the stains on its floorboards. The rafters overhead, dark with age and faintly greasy with decades of oil vapor, stretched from wall to wall in a simple pattern of support, and a single cobweb near the peak swayed gently in a draught too small for you to feel on your skin. The workbench bore the marks of its long service, shallow gouges and dark rings and one long, pale scratch where a metal tool had glanced across the surface years ago, and each mark was attended by a faint shadow of oil that had seeped into the wood and preserved it. The barrels at the far end of the shed stood in their wooden cradle like sleeping animals, their hoops tight and their staves sealed with wax that gleamed dully in the low light. And the stove, the iron heart of the room, radiated its steady warmth outward through the metal sides, the warmth rising in a gentle convection that stirred the air just enough to keep the smells of oil and wood smoke and sea salt moving in a slow, invisible circuit around the space. The refiner, still on his stool, drifted into a state that was not quite sleep and not quite waking, a state in which the boundaries of his own mind softened, and he became aware of the shed as an extension of himself, or himself as an extension of the shed. He felt the warmth of the kettle, as if it were his own warmth, felt the slow descent of the sediment, as if it were happening within his own body, and this feeling was not strange or mystical, but simply the natural result of a life spent in close attention to a single place and a single purpose. Time stretched out around him, each minute indistinguishable from the next, and the light through the window, which had been brightening slowly all morning, now reached its peak and began the long, almost imperceptible slide toward afternoon. The sun moving behind its layer of cloud in a path that could only be tracked by the shifting of the shadows on the floor. After a period that might have been an hour, or might have been two, the refiner opened his eyes and sat forward on his stool, his movements slow and unstartled, as if he were surfacing from a shallow dive into dark water. He stood up and walked to the stove, where he placed his hand against the side of the kettle once more, feeling the temperature that had held steady this entire time, the copper still warm but not hot, the heat of the fire still moderated by the careful adjustment of the vent. He lifted the muslin cloth and peered beneath the lid, and he saw that the surface of the oil had changed during the settling, becoming darker and more still, with a faint, glassy quality that had not been there before. The sediment that had been suspended in the liquid was no longer visible as a general haze, having gathered itself into a distinct layer at the very bottom of the kettle, a layer of dark, woolly material that would later be poured off and discarded or returned to the try-works for re-rendering. The oil above this layer was clearer now, still deeply colored but lacking the muddy opacity of its earlier state, and when the refiner dipped a glass tube into the kettle and withdrew a sample, holding it up to the light, he could see for the first time a faint glimmer of translucency at the edge of the glass, a hint that the oil was moving in the right direction. He returned the sample to the kettle and covered it once more, then turned his attention to the stove. The fire had burned very low during the long settling, the coals now more grey than orange, and he added a handful of small sticks and a single split log, rebuilding the heat just enough to keep the oil at its resting temperature overnight. He had no intention of moving on to the bleaching stage until the morning, because the bleaching required full daylight and a fresh start, and the oil would only benefit from a longer period of cooling and settling in the quiet darkness of the shed. So he arranged the stove for the evening, closing the vent a little more and ensuring that the log would burn slowly and safely, and then he gathered up the rags and the scrap bucket and the few tools that still needed cleaning, carrying them to the bench where he would attend to them before he left for the night. The day was drawing toward its close, the light through the window taking on the softer, more golden quality that preceded the evening fog, and the sounds of the waterfront outside had diminished to a few distant voices and the occasional cry of a gull settling for the night. The refiner worked his way through the small tossing tasks with the same unhurried pace he had maintained all day, wiping the paddle, scraping the last residue from the felt disc, pouring the collected drips from the scrap bucket into a small jar that would be reused, and sweeping the area around the stove where a few flakes of ash had fallen. When everything was clean and orderly and the shed was ready for the morning, he stood for a moment by the window, looking out at the harbor where the fog was already beginning to thicken again. A low white bank rolling in from the open sea like a silent tide of air. The kettle behind him sat warm and quiet, its dark cargo slowly, invisibly arranging itself into ever purer layers, and the shed itself seemed to sigh with the satisfaction of a day spent well and quietly, holding the promise of the bleaching that would begin with the next day's sun. The next morning arrived, not with a dramatic brightening of the sky, but with a gradual thinning of the darkness, the fog that had returned during the night now retreating once more toward the open sea, leaving behind a world that was clean-washed and still. The refiner walked the familiar path from the town to the waterfront, his boots making soft impressions in the sand that the tide had not yet reached. And when he unlatched the shed door and stepped inside, the air that greeted him was warm from the stove that had burned low all night, carrying the now familiar scent of oil and wood smoke, in a blend so constant it had become the shed's own breath. He went first to the copper kettle, as he always did, and laid his hand upon its curved side, feeling the residual warmth that told him the fire had not gone out, and then he lifted the muslin cloth and the lid and looked inside. The oil had settled further during the night, and the line between the clear upper portion and the dark sediment at the bottom was sharper now, more defined, a visible boundary that separated what was usable from what would be discarded. The refiner gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and replaced the lid, turning his attention to the preparations for the day ahead. The bleaching, which was the stage that now lay before him, would require sunlight more than anything else, the pale, steady light of a Nantucket spring that filtered through the window with a quality that was soft and diffuse, perfect for the slow work of pulling color from the oil without heating it. The refiner understood this light the way a baker understands the heat of his oven, having spent countless hours observing how it moved across the shed floor and how its intensity shifted with the hour and the weather. On an overcast day, the bleaching might take twice as long, and on a clear, cold day it might progress more quickly. But in all cases the process was slow, requiring patience that extended across days rather than hours. The refiner was not troubled by this slowness, having long ago made peace with the pace that the work demanded, and he set about preparing the shallow pans with the same methodical care that he brought to every step. The shallow tin pans were stored on a low shelf beneath the workbench, where they had been wiped clean the evening before and stacked in a neat column with scraps of cloth between each one to prevent scratching. The refiner lifted the stack and carried it to the bench, then separated the pans one by one, setting them out in a row that stretched the length of the pine surface. There were 8 pans in total, each one rectangular, measuring perhaps 18 inches long and 12 inches wide, with sides that rose only an inch above the base, the shallow depth being essential for the bleaching because it allowed the sunlight to penetrate the full thickness of the oil without the color at the bottom being shielded by the color at the top. The pans were made of tin that had been burnished to a dull silver gleam, their interiors smooth and free of rust, and on this morning after the long settling in the kettle, they were about to receive the oil that would spend the next week or more basking in the quiet light from the window. The refiner lifted the lid from the copper kettle and set it aside, and then he took up a different ladle from the one he had used for the filtering, this one with a wider bowl and a shorter handle, better suited to the task of transferring oil from the deep kettle to the shallow pans without splashing. He dipped the ladle into the kettle slowly, drawing from the upper portion of the oil where it was clearest, careful to leave the sediment layer undisturbed at the bottom, and he poured the first ladleful into the nearest tin pan with a steady, even tilt of his wrist. The oil flowed into the pan like dark honey, spreading outward to fill the corners and settling into a smooth, level surface that was perhaps 3/4 of an inch deep, a depth that the refiner had determined over the years to be optimal for bleaching, shallow enough to let the light through, but deep enough to hold a worthwhile volume. He moved along the row of pans, filling each one in turn, ladle after ladle, until all 8 pans held their measure of the still dark, but now translucent oil, their surfaces reflecting the grey morning light in 8 small, rectangular mirrors. When the transfer was complete, the refiner wiped the ladle and returned it to its hook, then stood back and surveyed the row of pans with a quiet sense of readiness. The next step would be to move the pans to the bleaching shelf, a special structure that he had built himself many years ago and that occupied the wall directly beneath the large window. The shelf was simple but clever, consisting of 3 long planks supported by iron brackets and arranged in a stair-step pattern so that the pans on the upper level did not cast shadows on the pans below. The lowest shelf was wide enough to hold 3 pans side by side, the middle shelf held 3, and the top shelf, which was the narrowest, held 2, making 8 positions in total, each one carefully angled to catch the maximum amount of daylight. The window above the shelf had been fitted with a second pane of glass set at a slight angle, which helped to diffuse the light and distribute it evenly across the pans without creating hot spots or shadows, and the refiner had also mounted 2 small mirrors on the window frame, one at each side, which could be adjusted to redirect the sunlight onto the pans during the hours when the sun was low and indirect. The whole arrangement was the product of years of tinkering and adjustment, and it worked with a quiet efficiency that needed no improvement. The refiner began to move the pans from the workbench to the bleaching shelf, carrying them one at a time with both hands held flat beneath the pan to keep it level and steady. The pans were not heavy, the oil they contain weighing only a few pounds each, but the refiner moved slowly anyway, placing each pan in its designated spot on the shelf, with the care of someone setting a table for an important guest. The lower shelf received its 3 pans first, then the middle shelf, and finally the top shelf, until all 8 pans were arranged in their angled rows, their dark surfaces facing the window like a congregation waiting for a service to begin. The refiner adjusted the 2 mirrors on the window frame, tilting them slightly so that the pale light from outside was gathered and directed downward onto the pans, brightening the surface of the oil by a small but noticeable degree, and then he stepped back and folded his arms, looking at his work with the calm satisfaction of a person who has done everything that can be done and is now content to wait. The light that fell upon the pans was, at this hour, still grey, and muted. The sun, not yet having broken through the high layer of cloud that stretched across the sky like a thin wool blanket. The oil in the pans looked almost black under this diffuse illumination, its darker tones swallowing the light rather than reflecting it, and a person who did not understand the bleaching process might have thought that nothing was happening at all. But the refiner knew that the process had already begun, that the very first photons of sunlight were even now penetrating the surface of the oil and interacting with the molecules that gave it its color, breaking them apart one by one in a slow, silent chemical dance that no human eye could perceive. The bleaching would take days, not because the light was weak, but because the color was stubborn, having been baked into the oil by the intense heat of the try-works and by the natural pigments that the whale had carried in its own tissues, pigments derived from the krill and the squid and the deep-sea creatures that had made up its diet. These pigments, the refiner knew, would yield eventually to the patient persuasion of the sun, and the oil would emerge as clear and pale as fine white wine, but only if the sunlight was allowed to do its work without interruption and without haste. The morning passed in a quiet that was different from the quiet of the settling day. That quiet had been heavy and still, a silence of waiting, while this quiet was lighter, a silence of slow, invisible activity. The refiner remained near the window for much of the time, not hovering over the pans, but remaining within a few steps, so that he could check the light from time to time and adjust the mirrors if the sun shifted behind the cloud. He ate a small portion of bread and cheese that he had brought wrapped in a cloth, eating slowly and without hurry, brushing the crumbs from his lap into a small pail kept for this purpose. He sharpened a small knife on a whetstone, though the knife was already sharp, the motion being more of a habit than a necessity. He sorted through a box of corks, checking each one for cracks or crumbling, and he replaced the string on one of the labels he would later use to mark the finished oil. All these small tasks occupied his hands while his attention remained loosely anchored to the pans on the shelf, the way a sailor's attention remains loosely anchored to the movement of the tide, even while he mends a net or coils a rope. Around midday, a subtle change occurred in the light, the high cloud beginning to thin and break apart, allowing a stronger, more golden illumination to fall through the window. The refiner noticed this at once, and rose from his stool to adjust the mirrors, tilting them to catch the newly available sun and direct it across the full length of the bleaching shelf. The oil in the pans responded to the brighter light by brightening itself, its surface taking on a faint warm glimmer that had not been visible in the grey of the morning, and for the first time you could see that the color was not a uniform black, but a deep, translucent amber with reddish undertones, like a garnet held up to a candle. The refiner leaned close to the nearest pan, his face reflected dimly in the oil, and he studied the color with the practiced eye of someone who had seen this transformation many times and knew exactly what signs to look for. The change so far was minimal, a mere hint of lightening at the very top of the oil, where the sun had been striking most directly, but it was enough to confirm that the bleaching was proceeding as expected, and the refiner straightened up and returned to his stool with the quiet confidence of a long familiarity. The afternoon continued in the same vein, the sun moving across the sky and the light through the window shifting in angle and intensity. The refiner rising occasionally to adjust the mirrors or to rotate the pans, turning each one by a half turn so that the oil moved gently in a slow swirl, and any part of it that had been shaded by the rim was given its turn in the light. The oil grew slightly warmer over the course of the day, absorbing the gentle heat of the sun, but it never became hot, the window glass in the distance from the stove keeping its temperature within a range that was comfortable to the touch. The smell of the oil, which had been strong and marine in the early stages of the refining, had now faded to something much milder, a faint, waxy note that blended with the clean smell of the wood and the ever-present salt of the sea air. The shed itself seemed to bask in the quiet, the only sounds being the soft creak of the building settling on its foundations, the distant cry of the gulls, and the near-silent whisper of the sunlight doing its work. As the day began to wind down and the shadows outside grew longer, the refiner performed the small ritual of closing the bleaching shelf for the night. He did not move the pans, leaving them in their places on the angled shelves, but he covered each one with a clean square of muslin to keep out the dust and the occasional fly that might wander in through the open window. He adjusted the mirrors so that they faced downward, protecting their silvered surfaces from any moisture that might condense during the night, and he closed the wooden shutter over the window, sealing the shed into a dim, worn darkness that would hold steady until the morning. The stove, which had been burning low all day, received a fresh log and a careful adjustment of the vent, and then the refiner swept the floor one last time, gathered his cloth and his empty bread wrap, and stood by the door looking back at the 8 covered pans, their muslin cloths glowing pale in the low light like a row of sleeping doves. The oil had already begun its slow journey toward clarity, and the days ahead would carry it the rest of the way, 1 hour of sunlight at a time. The days that followed the first bleaching blended into one another with a smoothness that made them difficult to separate in memory, each morning arriving quietly and each evening departing without fanfare, the only measure of time being the slow, almost imperceptible lightening of the oil in the 8 shallow pans. The refiner came to the shed every day at the same hour, when the fog was still lifting and the waterfront was just beginning to stir, and he began each morning by opening the wooden shutter and folding back the muslin cloths that covered the pans, draping them over the edge of the shelf so that the oil lay bare to the new light. He would stand for a moment with his hands resting on the shelf edge, studying the color of the oil in the closest pan, comparing it in his mind to the color it had held the day before and the day before that, noting the subtle shift from dark amber to a slightly paler shade that still held a reddish warmth but was slowly, patiently releasing it to the sun. Then he would adjust the mirrors on the window frame, tilting them to catch the morning light at its best angle, and the day's quiet work would begin. The central task during this stage was the stirring, a simple, repetitive motion that the refiner performed every 2 hours from the moment the shutters were opened until the light began to fade in the late afternoon. He kept no clock and consulted no timepiece, trusting instead to an internal rhythm that had been built over years of practice, a sense of the day's progression that was as reliable as the tide. When the moment felt right, he would rise from wherever he had been sitting or standing and walk to the bleaching shelf, taking up the glass rod that rested in a wooden groove along its front edge. The rod was about the length of his forearm and slightly thicker than his thumb, made of clear, solid glass with rounded ends, cool to the touch in the first stirring of the day, and gradually warming as the morning advanced. He would begin with the pan at the left end of the lowest shelf, lowering the tip of the rod into the oil, and then moving it in a slow, continuous figure-8 pattern, tracing the shape over and over while he counted silently to 60, each count marking a full circuit of the rod through the liquid. The oil parted around the glass with a gentle, silent resistance, its surface rippling in small, lazy waves that lapped against the tin sides without spilling over, and the motion redistributed the liquid so that every molecule was given its equal time in the light. When the 60 counts were complete, he would lift the rod, let the excess oil drain back into the pan for a few seconds, and then move to the next pan, repeating the same figure-8, the same 60 counts, until all 8 pans had been stirred. The sound of the glass rod against the tin was the quietest of music, a soft, fluid clink that occurred only when the rod accidentally touched the bottom or the side, which happened perhaps 2 or 3 times per pan. It was a sound that lingered in the air for no more than a heartbeat, absorbed immediately by the wood of the walls and the wool of the felt scraps and the heavy, patient atmosphere of the shed. Between stirrings, the refiner returned to his other small occupations, which were numerous but never urgent, and he moved through them with the same figure-8 rhythm in his mind, his hands busy while his attention remained loosely tethered to the light and the oil and the quiet passage of the day. One of the tasks that filled the waiting time was the wiping of bottles with a soft, lint-free cloth, a task that had no pressing necessity, but that contributed to the general order of the shed. The refiner kept a collection of glass bottles on a high shelf above the workbench, bottles of various sizes that had once held lamp oil or spirits or medicine and had since been cleaned and saved for future use. He would take down one bottle at a time, hold it up to the window light to check for dust or film, and then polish its interior with a small brush and its exterior with the cloth until the glass sparkled with a clean, transparent gleam. When the bottle was finished, he would set it back on the shelf in a precise row, its neck aligned with its neighbors, and then he would take down the next one, working his way through the collection at a pace that could occupy half a morning. The task required no thought, only a gentle, repetitive attention that allowed his mind to drift while his hands remained occupied, and he found a quiet satisfaction in the way the row of bottles grew longer and brighter, a small monument to patience. Another task was the labeling of the empty wooden kegs that waited in the corner for the finished oil. The refiner kept a stack of paper labels, each one cut to a rectangle about the size of his palm, printed with simple black lettering that read the name of his shed and the words "Pure Spermaceti Oil" in a modest serif typeface. He would take down a label, moisten its back with a small brush dipped in a pot of thin paste, and then smooth it onto the head of a keg with careful, even pressure, his fingers working from the center outward to eliminate any bubbles or wrinkles. Beneath the printer text, he would write the date in pencil, using small, neat numerals that leaned slightly to the right, and then he would set the keg aside and reach for the next one. The paste smelled faintly of flour and water, a clean, homely scent that mingled with the other odors of the shed, and the soft sound of the brush swiping across the paper was as regular as a heartbeat. The refiner labeled as many kegs as he had empty, stacking them in a tidy pyramid near the door, and when the task was complete, he would clean the brush and the paste pot and return them to their shelf, ready for the next time. At other times, when the bottles were clean and the kegs were labeled and the floor had been swept, the refiner would sit on his stool near the window and mend the worn edges of a felt pad with a needle and thread. The felt pads were the same ones used in the filtering, and though they were durable, their edges tended to fray after repeated use, the wool fibers separating and thinning until the pad no longer fit snugly in the funnel. The refiner kept a small sewing kit in a wooden box, a few needles of different sizes, a spool of strong linen thread, the color of pale straw, and a small pair of scissors with blades that were sharpened to a fine edge. He would thread a needle, knot the end of the thread with a quick twist of his fingers, and then begin to stitch along the fraying edge, taking small, even stitches that drew the loose fibers back into the body of the felt. The needle passed through the wool with a soft, scratching sound, and the thread followed it in a neat, close line that was nearly invisible against the grayish-white of the felt. The refiner worked slowly, his hands steady, and when one edge was secure, he would turn the pad and begin on the next, working his way around until the pad was once again whole and tight. The mended pads went into a stack on the bench, ready for the next time the crude oil arrived, and the sewing kit went back into its box, the lid closing with a gentle click. Between these tasks, the refiner would sometimes sharpen the blade of a small knife that he rarely used, a simple folding knife with a bone handle and a blade that had grown thin from years of honing. He kept a whetstone in a shallow wooden tray, and he would wet the stone with a few drops of oil, then draw the blade across it in long, smooth strokes, first one side and then the other, the sound a soft, metallic whisper that rose and fell with each pass. He tested the edge by holding it up to the light and looking for any reflection, and when it was sharp enough, he would fold the knife, wipe the blade with an oily rag, and set it back in the drawer, the task complete without any outward sign of accomplishment. The knife sharpening, like the bottle wiping and the label pasting and the felt mending, was not done because it needed doing, but because the waiting time required occupation, and the refiner had learned long ago that the best way to pass the hours was to fill them with small, gentle actions that kept the hands moving and the mind at ease. Throughout all of these tasks, the light continued to shift, the sun climbing and then descending in its arc, the mirrors on the window frame needing occasional small adjustments that the refiner made without thinking. Every 2 hours he rose to stir the pans, and each time he did so, he noticed the change in the oil, a change so gradual that it was always a surprise in retrospect, like watching a child grow taller day by day without ever seeing the height increase. The first stirring of the morning would find the oil still a deep, warm amber, the color of strong tea held in a glass. The second stirring around mid-morning would reveal the faintest paling at the very surface, a thin layer where the sunlight had been working most directly, a layer that was barely a shade lighter than the rest. The third stirring after the noon hour, when the light was strongest, would show that the paling had begun to spread downward, the color now more of a honey than a tea, still rich and warm, but less dense, less opaque. The fourth stirring in the mid-afternoon would find the oil drinking in the lower angled light with a transparency that had not been there before, a clarity at the edges that allowed you to see the tin floor of the pan through a 1/4 inch of liquid. The fifth and sixth stirrings, as the evening began to draw near, would confirm the progress, the oil moving inch by inch toward the pale straw color that was the goal. The refiner did not speak of these changes, or even think of them in words, but he felt them in the same way he felt the warmth of the stove and the weight of the ladle, as a quiet, ongoing fact of the world. He would sometimes hold a glass vial of the oil up to the window and watch the light pass through it, noting the way the beam bent and scattered, and he would see in that small captured sample the promise of the finished product, the clear, steady burning fuel that would light the great lenses of the lighthouses. But he did not hurry toward that promise, because the bleaching could not be rushed any more than the tide could be hurried or the seasons accelerated, and so he simply continued with his stirring and his small tasks, letting the days unfold one after another in a gentle, unbroken chain. The weather during this period held steady, a fortunate condition that the refiner appreciated without comment. Each morning the fog lifted to reveal a pale, overcast sky that diffused the sunlight into an even, shadowless glow, perfect for the bleaching because it heated the oil very little while still providing the full spectrum of light that was required. The temperature in the shed remained comfortable, the stove burning low and steady, the window open just a crack at the top to allow a small circulation of fresh air. The sounds of the waterfront came and went, the gulls crying and falling silent, the occasional cart passing on the sand, the distant ring of a hammer on metal from the boatyard. But these noises seemed to belong to a different reality, one that moved faster and with more purpose, while inside the shed everything remained suspended in a slow, dreamy rhythm that had no need for urgency. As the days accumulated, the oil in the pans continued its transformation, and by the end of the first full week the color had shifted from the dark amber of crude oil to a much lighter shade, a pale golden brown that held only a memory of its former depth. The refiner, holding the glass rod above the pan and watching the oil drip back in a thin, clear stream, could see that the oil was now translucent enough that the rod was visible below the surface, a wavering ghost of glass in the golden liquid. The smell had faded almost entirely, leaving behind only the faintest waxy scent, clean and unobtrusive, a scent that would not compete with the salt air or the wood smoke of a lighthouse keeper's quarters. The sediment that had been present in the earlier stages was long gone, left behind in the kettle and the filter, and the oil now held no visible particles at all, only a smooth, even body of liquid that responded to the stirring with a quiet, fluid grace. The refiner knew that the bleaching was not yet complete, that the oil required perhaps another 2 or 3 days of sunlight to reach the perfect water-white clarity that was the standard for the finest spermaceti oil. He also knew that the final stage, the polishing with fuller's earth, would remove the last faint traces of color and any remaining impurities that the sunlight could not reach. But for now the pans sat on their shelves, the mirrors caught the light, and the quiet days continued to pass, each one bringing the oil a little closer to its final form. The refiner, seated on his stool with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes half closed against the gentle brightness from the window, felt the weight of time as a comfortable presence, a companion rather than a burden, and he let the afternoon drift around him with the same patience that the oil was learning, moment by moment, to become clear. The morning that marked the beginning of the final refinement arrived with a sky that was the color of thin milk, a high, even layer of cloud that diffused the sunlight into a soft, shadowless glow, exactly the kind of light that the refiner had learned to appreciate during the bleaching stage. He walked the short path from the town with his hands tucked into the pockets of his wool waistcoat, his breath visible in small, fleeting puffs that vanished as quickly as they appeared. And when he reached the shed, he found the wooden shutter still closed and the building quiet, the stove having kept its low fire alive through the night as it always did. He unlatched the door and stepped inside, and the first thing he did was to cross directly to the bleaching shelf where the 8 shallow pans had been resting under their muslin covers for more than a week now, the oil within them having been stirred and watched and turned with a patience that had become its own form of timekeeping. He folded back the cloths and studied the surface of the nearest pan, leaning close so that his face was reflected as a dim oval in the pale golden liquid, and he saw what he had been waiting to see. The oil had reached a clarity that allowed the tin floor of the pan to be visible through its full 3/4-inch depth. The color now a very light straw, just a hint of warmth remaining, and the smell that rose from it was so faint and clean as to be almost indistinguishable, scent of the shackets itself. The bleaching was complete, or nearly so, and the moment had come for the last stage, the polishing with fuller's earth that would remove those final traces of color and any invisible impurities that still lingered. The refiner began this new stage by gathering the bleached oil from the 8 pans into a single clean copper vessel, a pot with a capacity of about 2 gallons that he had scoured the evening before until its interior gleamed like a new coin. He lifted each pan from the shelf with the same careful two-handed grip he had used to place them there, and he tipped the oil out in a slow, deliberate stream, tilting the pan gradually so that the liquid slid into the pot without splashing or leaving a single drop behind. The oil moved with a lighter, more fluid ease than it had in its crude state, its reduced viscosity, a result of the bleaching and the gentle warmth that still radiated from the stove. And it filled the pot with a color that was now more white wine than amber, a pale, translucent gold that caught the window light in a soft glow. When all 8 pans were empty and had been wiped clean with a cloth and stacked on the bench for later washing, the refiner set the pot on the stove's warming shelf, not directly over the fire, but close enough to maintain the oil at the mild temperature it would need for the final filtration to proceed smoothly. He then turned his attention to the materials that would perform the polishing, materials that had been waiting on the workbench in their earthenware jars for precisely this purpose. Fuller's earth, the refiner knew, was a remarkable substance, a fine grey powder that had been dug from the ground in distant places and shipped across the ocean to this small island, where it found its purpose in the quiet shed by the waterfront. It was composed of microscopic particles that possessed a natural affinity for the colored molecules remaining in the oil, a chemical attraction that would draw those molecules out of solution and bind them to the Earth's surface, leaving the oil itself untouched and clear. The refiner opened the largest jar of Fuller's earth and peered inside, where the powder sat in a soft, pale mound that shifted slightly when he tilted the jar. He scooped out a portion with a small tin cup and measured it by eye against the volume of oil in the pot, using a proportion that he had learned through years of adjustment, and that required no written record because his hands remembered it. He transferred the powder to a small mixing bowl, added a ladleful of the warm oil from the pot, and began to stir with a narrow wooden spatula, working the oil into the powder with a slow, patient motion that gradually transformed the dry, dusty earth into a thin, grey slurry, smooth and uniform with the consistency of heavy cream. The stirring produced a soft, wet sound, the spatula moving in figure eights that were an echo of the stirring he had performed on the bleaching pans, and the refiner's wrist circled with the same unhurried rhythm, his attention focused on the mixture until every grain of powder was incorporated and no lumps remained. With the slurry prepared, the refiner assembled the percolation apparatus that would carry out the final polishing. He reached up to the highest shelf and brought down a tall glass cylinder, a vessel that stood perhaps 18 inches high and 4 inches in diameter, its walls perfectly straight and its bottom drawn into a narrow neck that tapered to a small opening fitted with a cork and a short glass spout. The cylinder was heavy and clear, its glass showing a faint greenish tint when held to the light, and the refiner inspected it carefully for any cracks or chips before setting it into a wooden stand that held it upright over a clean glass receiver, a flask of the kind used by apothecaries with a wide body and a narrow neck. The spout of the cylinder rested just inside the mouth of the receiver, and the arrangement stood on the workbench near the window, where the light was good and the refiner could watch the progress without having to move from his stool. The cylinder required a bed of filtering material at its base, and the refiner prepared this bed with the same methodical care he gave to everything. He took a square of fine cheesecloth, folded it into a double layer, and pressed it down into the narrow neck of the cylinder, using a long glass rod to tamp it gently into a firm pad that would hold the subsequent materials in place. On top of the cheesecloth he poured a layer of crushed charcoal, the pieces no larger than small peas, their black surfaces dull and powdery, and he leveled the charcoal with the rod until it formed an even bed about an inch thick. The charcoal, like the fuller's earth, had been prepared specifically for this use, burned from clean hardwood and then ground and sifted to a uniform size, and its purpose was to catch any remaining traces of the marine scent that might have survived the bleaching, the porous carbon absorbing those last volatile notes and locking them away. On top of the charcoal, the refiner added a second thin layer of cheesecloth, and then he poured the slurry of fuller's earth and oil onto this layer, spreading it with the spatula into an even coating that covered the charcoal completely, the grey mixture settling into a smooth, damp bed that would serve as the primary polishing agent. The cylinder was now ready, and the refiner stepped back for a moment to survey the apparatus, his hand resting lightly on the wooden stand, before he turned to fetch the pot of bleached oil from the warming shelf. The pot was warm to the touch, but not hot, the oil within it maintaining the gentle temperature that would allow it to flow freely through the percolation bed without cooling and thickening, and the refiner carried it to the bench with both hands, setting it beside the cylinder. He had a small glass cup with a pouring lip that he used to transfer the oil from the pot to the cylinder, filling it only halfway each time so that he could pour without spilling, and he began to introduce the oil to the top of the cylinder in a thin, steady stream that landed on the layer of fuller's earth with a soft, pattering sound. The oil pooled above the earth, a pale golden puddle that slowly soaked into the grey slurry and then began its journey downward, pushing through the cheesecloth and the charcoal and finally emerging from the spout at the bottom as a series of small, hesitant drops. The first drops struck the glass receiver with a clean, high note, a delicate plink that hung in the quiet air for a fraction of a second before dissolving, and then another drop fell, and another, the rhythm establishing itself as a slow, irregular cadence that was as calming as any lullaby. The oil that collected in the receiver was, even from the very first drops, visibly different from the oil that had entered the cylinder. It was clearer, brighter, the faint straw color that had survived the bleaching now fading to a mere suggestion, a whisper of warmth that was almost, but not quite, entirely absent. The refiner took up the glass rod and held it upright in the receiver, watching how the oil climbed the rod and how the light from the window passed through the liquid column, and he saw a sparkle there that had not been present in any of the previous stages, a pure, water-white glimmer that signaled the near completion of the long process. He did not smile or make any gesture of satisfaction, because the work was not yet finished, and he had never been a man given to outward expressions, but something in his posture relaxed by a small degree, the way a tree relaxes after a long wind dies down, and he returned the rod to its groove and settled onto his stool to watch the percolation continue. The percolation was, by its nature, a slow process, slower even than the bleaching, because the oil now had to find its way through the dense bed of fuller's earth one molecule at a time, each colored molecule colliding with a particle of earth and sticking there while the clear oil slid past and continued downward. The drops continued to fall at their unhurried pace, sometimes quickening into a thin stream for a few seconds when the pressure above the bed increased, then slowing again as the oil redistributed itself through the slurry, and the sound of the drops striking the receiver became a steady background pulse that the refiner absorbed without conscious attention. He occupied himself during the long descent of the oil with small, quiet tasks that kept the shed in order, returning the empty tin pans to their shelf, washing the mixing bowl and the spatula in a bucket of water that he kept near the door, trimming the wicks in the lantern box, and adding a single log to the stove when the fire began to gutter. He did not hurry, and he did not watch the cylinder continuously, trusting that the apparatus would do its work without supervision, but every half hour or so he would walk to the bench and check the level of the oil in the receiver, noting the slow rise and the increasing brilliance of the liquid. By the time the sun had begun its descent toward the late afternoon and the light through the window had taken on a golden slant, the percolation was nearing its end. The last of the bleached oil had been poured into the cylinder hours before, and the pool above the fuller's earth had long since vanished, drawn downward into the bed. The drops from the spout had become intermittent, then ceased altogether, and the refiner leaned close to the apparatus to see that the oil remaining in the cylinder was only a thin film clinging to the glass above the spent earth, a film that would never reach the spout but would be recovered later with a small spatula. He lifted the receiver, a flask now filled with a liquid so clear and pure that it looked like melted glass, and he held it up to the window, letting the light stream through it in a brilliant, colorless beam. The oil was perfect, as close to water in appearance as a fat could ever be, with only the faintest hint of a blue-white tint that was not a flaw but the signature of the highest-grade spermaceti oil, a tint that would burn with a steady, smoke-free flame in the lenses of the great lighthouses. The odor was virtually non-existent, a clean, wax-like scent, so subtle that it could only be detected by holding the flask directly beneath the nose. And even then, it was more a sensation than a smell, a cool, neutral presence that promised a clean burn. The refiner lowered the flask and placed it carefully in a wooden stand that had been carved to fit its shape, a stand that kept the vessel upright and secure, and then he turned to the apparatus on the bench. He dismantled the cylinder with the same careful attention he had given to assembling it, removing the spent cheesecloth and its load of darkened fuller's earth and charcoal, which he wrapped in a piece of old cloth and set aside to be returned to the try-works, where the remaining oil in it could be extracted by heat. The glass cylinder and the receiver's cork and spout were washed with warm water and wiped until they shone, then returned to their high shelf for the next time they would be needed. The bench was cleared, the tools were hung in their places, and the floor was swept of the few stray granules of charcoal that had escaped during the preparation, the broom moving in long, slow strokes that gathered the dust into a small pile and then out the door into the afternoon air. The shed, which had held the day's quiet activity within its walls, now looked as clean and orderly as it had on the morning when the work began, the only evidence of the transformation being the flask of crystal oil that stood on the bench, catching the slanted sunlight in a pool of liquid diamond. The refiner washed his hands in the bucket by the door, drying them on a cloth that hung from a peg, and then he stood for a long moment with his back against the workbench, his eyes resting on the flask with the same quiet, neutral attention he had given to the crude oil, the felt, the sunlight, and the fuller's earth. The work of refinement was, for this batch, essentially complete, the oil now ready to be tested for its final quality and then packaged and sent out into the world. But the refiner did not think of what would come next in any hurry. He had learned over many years that the completion of one step was not a finish line, but merely a quiet pause before the next step began, and he accepted this pause with the same evenness that he accepted everything else. Outside, the waterfront was winding down for the evening, the carts no longer creaking on the sand and the gulls settling on the pilings with their heads tucked into their wings, and inside the shed the warm, steady silence that had accompanied every stage of the oil's journey seemed to gather around the flask like a soft, protective shroud, holding the clear liquid in its gentle embrace until the morning would bring the testing and the flame. The flask of finished oil had rested on the workbench through the night, its neck stoppered with a clean cork, and its clear contents catching the faint glow of the bank stove coals whenever the fire shifted behind its iron door. The refiner arrived the next morning with the same quiet punctuality that had marked every other day of the refining, and when he opened the shutter to let in the grey, misty light, the first thing he did was to lift the flask and hold it to the window, checking that the oil had remained perfectly clear and that no sediment had formed during the cooling. The liquid was exactly as he had left it the evening before, a pure water-white column that showed not the slightest haze or cloud, and he set it back in its wooden stand with a gentle, precise motion, satisfied that the final stage of the work could now proceed. The testing of the flame was a necessary step, not because the refiner doubted the quality of the oil, but because every batch required verification before it could be packaged and sent out to the lighthouses and the street lamps, and the verification was a simple, straightforward procedure that he had performed so many times it had become as natural as breathing. He began by selecting a small glass cup from a shelf near the window, a cup designed specifically for burning tests, with a wide, stable base and a narrow neck that flared into a shallow bowl at the top, its glass thin and clear so that the flame could be observed from every angle. The cup was clean and dry, having been washed the week before and stored upside down on a cloth, and the refiner polished its exterior with a soft rag until the glass shone with a transparent gleam. He placed the cup on the stone slab that served as a heat-proof surface on the workbench, a square of dark slate that had been set into the pine so that it sat flush and level, and then he turned his attention to the wick. The wicks were stored in the small wooden box on the bench, a box with a sliding lid that moved smoothly in its grooves, and inside, arranged in neat rows like sleeping caterpillars, lay dozens of braided cotton strands, each one cut to a uniform length of about 4 inches. The refiner selected a wick and examined it briefly, running it between his thumb and forefinger to check that the braiding was tight and even, and that no loose fibers protruded. Then he laid it across the mouth of the glass cup so that one end hung down into the bowl while the other draped over the rim. He adjusted the wick's position carefully, sliding it a fraction of an inch one way and then the other, until the lower end rested exactly at the bottom of the bowl, where it would draw oil upward by capillary action, and the upper end stood just above the rim, the portion that would hold the flame. The cotton was soft and white, and it looked almost luminous against the dark slate of the bench, a small expectant presence waiting to fulfill its purpose. Now the refiner lifted the flask of finished oil and removed the cork, which came free with a soft, dry pop, and he tilted the flask over the glass cup with a controlled, gradual movement, pouring the oil in a thin, steady stream that flowed down the inside wall of the cup rather than splashing directly onto the wick, a technique that prevented air bubbles from forming in the liquid. The oil rose in the cup with a silent, smooth motion, its surface so clear that it was nearly invisible against the glass, and the refiner filled the bowl to just below the rim, leaving enough space that the oil would not spill when the wick was lit. He set the flask back in its stand and recorked it, then waited for a minute or two, watching as the lower end of the wick darkened and became saturated, the oil climbing the cotton fibers with the same patient, invisible movement that had characterized every other stage of the refining. The wick darkened from white to a pale, translucent gray, and a tiny, glistening bead of oil appeared at its upper tip, a signal that the capillary action was working and that the wick was ready to receive the flame. The refiner reached for the flint and steel that sat on the small shelf above the stove, the same flint and steel he had used to light the fire on the first morning, their surfaces worn smooth by countless strikes. He held the steel over the wick and struck the flint against it with a short, practiced motion, producing a small shower of sparks that scattered onto the cotton, and on the third strike, one of the sparks caught the oil-saturated tip, and the tiny blue flame flickered into existence, no larger than a pea, trembling and uncertain at first as if it were testing the air. The refiner withdrew the flint and steel and set them aside, then leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the infant flame as it steadied and grew, the blue giving way to a warm golden yellow as the flame found its footing and began to burn in earnest. The flame rose from the wick in a tall, slender shape, an elongated teardrop that stood perfectly still, without flickering or wavering, its edges clean and defined, its core a bright, almost white center surrounded by a softer, golden halo. There was no smoke, not the faintest wisp, and there was no crackling or sputtering, only a smooth, silent consumption of the oil that was as steady as a heartbeat. The light that the flame cast was remarkable in its purity, a clean, white illumination that filled the immediate area of the workbench and threw gentle, softened shadows against the far wall of the shed. The refiner held his hand beside the flame, palm facing inward, and felt the mild, even warmth that radiated from it. A warmth that was sufficient to heat a small room, but not intense enough to scorch or singe. The kind of warmth that a lighthouse keeper would welcome on a cold winter night high in a stone tower. He watched the flame for a long time, his face illuminated from below in a way that softened the lines around his eyes and made his expression appear both focused and serene. And he noted every aspect of the burn, the height of the flame, the shape of the glow, the absence of any dark particles rising from the tip, the way the wick charred at its very end, without crumbling or bending. All of these observations were filed away in his mind without conscious effort, forming a complete assessment of the oil's quality that required no written record, because the evidence was there before his eyes. To measure the burn rate, the refiner reached for the sand glass that sat on the corner of the bench, a simple instrument consisting of two glass bulbs connected by a narrow neck, filled with fine white sand that took exactly 1 hour to pass from the upper bulb to the lower. He turned the sand glass over and set it down beside the cup, the sand beginning its slow, silent descent in a thin, continuous stream that sparkled slightly in the lamplight. The flame continued to burn, steady and unchanging, and the refiner settled onto his stool to watch the passage of the hour, his hands folded in his lap and his breathing slow and regular, his attention divided between the flame and the sand without tension or restlessness. The shed around him was quiet, the only sounds being the very faint hiss of the flame consuming the oil and the occasional soft creak of the building's timbers adjusting to the warmth of the stove, and the light from the window and the light from the flame mingled together in a gentle golden blend that made the interior of the shed feel like a place outside of ordinary time. As the hour progressed, The oil level in the glass cup descended by a small, measurable amount, the surface creeping downward at a rate that was slow but consistent, and the flame maintained its steady shape and its clean, smoke-free glow throughout. The wick charred evenly, the burned portion forming a small dark cap at the very tip that did not grow or spread, and the refiner watched this with the same calm approval, knowing that a wick that charred too quickly or too slowly would indicate an impurity in the oil or an error in the refining, defects that were simply not present. When the last grains of sand had fallen through the neck of the sandglass and the upper bulb stood empty, the refiner lifted his head and looked at the level of the oil, comparing it in his mind to the starting level he had noted an hour before, and he judged the burn rate to be exactly what it should be, the consumption steady and economical, the kind of burn that would keep a lighthouse beam shining through an entire winter night without needing to be refilled. The test was complete, and the refiner reached for the brass snuffer that hung from a small hook on the side of the workbench, a tool shaped like a tiny bell with a long handle, its interior blackened from years of use. He positioned the snuffer over the flame and lowered it gently until the bell covered the wick entirely, cutting off the air and extinguishing the flame in a single silent motion, leaving behind only a thin curl of smoke that dissipated almost instantly and a faint clean smell that was more like warm wax than burning oil. The wick, now blackened and slightly shortened, remained upright in the cup, and the oil that surrounded it was still perfectly clear, the heat of the flame having caused no discoloration or clouding. The refiner lifted the snuffer and wiped its interior with a rag, then hung it back on its hook, and he poured the remaining oil from the cup back into the flask through a small funnel lined with a scrap of muslin, recovering every drop because none of it had been degraded by the burning test. The glass cup and the funnel were washed and dried and returned to their places, the wick was discarded into the scrap bucket, and the flask stood once again on the bench, its contents diminished by only a tiny fraction, the quality of the oil confirmed by the silent, steady flame that had burned without smoke or sputter. The refiner took a moment to look around the shed, at the clean bench and the orderly shelves, and the warm stove and the window that looked out onto the grey, peaceful harbour, and he felt the quiet sense of a task completed, not a feeling of triumph or excitement, but simply a recognition that the oil was ready, that the long chain of filtering and settling and bleaching and polishing had yielded exactly what it was supposed to yield. The flame test had been the final proof, and the proof had been given, and now there was nothing left to do but to prepare the oil for its journey outward, to the lighthouses and the street lamps and the long, dark nights that it would illuminate with its clean, unwavering light. The flask of tested oil stood on the workbench, its crystal contents catching the late morning light that angled through the window in a broad, soft beam, and the refiner, having confirmed the quality of the batch with the steady, smoke-free flame earlier that day, now turned his attention to the final practical stage that would send the oil out into the world. The shed was warm and quiet, the stove ticking gently as the fire settled into its low, steady rhythm, and the workbench had been cleared of all tools save those that would be needed for the filling, a simple arrangement of vessels and closures that looked, in the slanted light, like a still-life painting of domestic industry. The refiner stood before the bench with his sleeves rolled to his elbows and his hands freshly washed, surveying the collection of containers that had been brought out of storage and arranged in neat rows according to their size and purpose. The small square tin canisters for the lighthouse keepers and the larger wooden kegs for the street lamplighters of the distant mainland cities. The tin canisters had been manufactured in a workshop on the other side of the island, each one formed from a single sheet of tinned iron folded into a rectangular shape and soldered along the seam, with a narrow neck at the top that accepted a cork stopper and a small folded handle on one side for easy carrying. They were plain and functional, their surfaces showing the faint, swirling marks of the tinsmith's finishing wheel, and they held perhaps a quart of oil apiece, an amount that a lighthouse keeper could manage without spilling even while climbing the steep, winding stairs of a stone tower in a high wind. The refiner had brought out 24 of these canisters from the storage shelf, and they sat on the bench in 4 rows of 6, their open necks facing upward like a choir of small silent mouths. Beside them, on the floor near the barrels, stood the wooden kegs, 5 of them in total, each one a small barrel, about half the height of the crude oil cask that had arrived weeks earlier, their staves made of tight-grained oak and their iron hoops painted black to resist the salt air. The kegs had been fitted with clean, new bungs and had been inspected that morning for any sign of leakage or weakness, their interiors smelling of the dry, slightly sweet scent of cured oak that had been seasoned by years of holding oil. The refiner began the filling by attending to the tin canisters because their smaller size made them easier to manage, and because the lighthouse orders were always the first to be fulfilled, the steady beams of Sankati Head and Brant Point being the nearest and most constant recipients of his oil. He lifted the flask of finished oil, which still held nearly all of its original volume except for the small amount consumed in the testing, and he unstoppered the cork with a gentle twist and pull, the glass neck releasing a faint, clean scent that was barely perceptible. Into the mouth of the flask he fitted a small brass funnel, one that had been polished until its interior gleamed, its spout narrow enough to fit inside the neck of a tin canister without touching the sides, and he began the slow, careful work of transferring the oil from the flask to the smaller vessels. He set the first canister on the stone slab, centering it beneath the funnel spout, and he tilted the flask with the controlled, gradual motion of someone who had poured thousands of such streams and knew exactly how the liquid would behave. The oil flowed into the canister in a thin, glistening rope that made a soft, pouring sound, a gentle glug-glug that was lower and more muffled than the sound of water, because the oil was thicker and clung to itself as it fell. The canister filled steadily, the level rising without turbulence, and the refiner watched the surface approach the neck with an unblinking attention, halting his pour at exactly the moment when the oil reached the point where the cork would sit, leaving a small airspace that would allow the oil to expand slightly on a warm day without pushing the stopper out. He withdrew the funnel and set the flask upright, then took a clean rag and wiped the rim of the canister, removing any stray drop that might prevent a tight seal. The corks that would stopper the canisters were stored in a small wooden box on the bench, a box divided into compartments that held corks of different sizes, each one cut from the bark of a cork oak and shaped into a truncated cone that would fit snugly into the canister's neck. The refiner selected a cork that matched the opening, feeling its springiness between his fingers, and he pressed it gently into the neck, twisting it slightly as he pushed so that the cork seated itself evenly all around. When the cork was about halfway in, he reached for a small wooden mallet that lay on the bench, a mallet with a head made of hard maple and a handle worn smooth, and he gave the cork a single light tap that drove it home with a soft, definite thud, the sound resonating briefly in the quiet shed before fading into the general hum of the stove. He ran his thumb around the joint between cork and tin, feeling for any gap or irregularity, and finding none, he set the sealed canister aside on a tray that he kept for the finished products, its tin surface catching the light with a dull, silvery gleam. The process repeated, canister after canister, with a rhythm that was as steady and unhurried as the dripping of the percolation or the figure-eight stirring of the bleaching pans. The refiner filled each canister to the correct level, wiped its rim, selected a cork, and tapped it home with a mallet, the soft thuds punctuating the afternoon at regular intervals like the strokes of a distant, muffled clock. The tray of finished canisters grew from 1 to 3 to 6 to 9, their square shapes standing shoulder to shoulder in a tight, orderly formation, and the level of oil in the flask descended by small, measured increments, the crystal-clear liquid now divided among a dozen small, portable vessels that were ready for the rough journey to the lighthouse towers. When all 24 canisters had been filled and corked, the refiner turned to the next part of the sealing process, which was the application of beeswax to the tops of the corks. Beeswax served as a secondary barrier, a waterproof seal that would keep the oil from seeping out if the canister was jostled or tipped, and it also provided a visual indicator of whether the canister had been opened, because the wax would show any cracks or breaks immediately. The refiner kept a small pot of beeswax on a warming shelf near the stove, the wax having been melted earlier that morning and kept liquid by the gentle ambient heat. He carried the pot to the bench, its contents a pale golden yellow and its surface smooth and glossy, and he took up a small wooden stick that had a flattened end, a simple tool he had whittled himself years ago for this exact purpose. He dipped the stick into the wax and then drizzled a thin, even layer over the top of each cork, the wax flowing into the small gap between the cork and the tin rim and hardening almost immediately as it cooled, forming a smooth, slightly domed seal that was the color of pale honey. The smell of the warm beeswax was sweet and clean, a gentle, natural scent that blended easily with the other smells of the shed, and the refiner moved down the row of canisters with the same methodical care, dipping and drizzling until every cork was capped with its golden seal. With the canisters complete, the refiner carried the tray to a shelf near the door where the finished goods were stored until they could be collected, and he returned to the bench to address the wooden kegs. The kegs were larger and heavier than the canisters, each one holding perhaps 5 gallons, and they would require a slightly different approach because their bungs were larger and their necks wider, demanding more attention to ensure a complete seal. The refiner rolled the first keg onto a low wooden cradle that held it steady with its bunghole facing upward, and then he lifted the flask, which still held a substantial quantity of oil, and fitted the brass funnel into its mouth once more. The funnel's spout fit easily into the keg's bunghole, and the refiner began to pour, the oil flowing into the keg with a deeper, more resonant sound, a hollow, drumming note that spoke of the larger emptiness within. The filling of a keg took longer than the filling of a canister, and the refiner paused once to let the oil settle before adding the final measure, checking the level with a long wooden dipstick that he inserted into the bunghole and withdrew, reading the oily mark at a glance before deciding that the keg was exactly full enough. The keg's bung was a larger, heavier stopper made of the same cork material, and the refiner wrapped its tapered sides with a thin strip of muslin before driving it into the hole, the muslin acting as a gasket that would swell slightly if any oil touched it, creating an even tighter seal. He used the same wooden mallet, but with firmer, more deliberate strikes, the sound of the mallet against the bung producing a deeper, more solid thump that vibrated through the wooden staves and echoed in the hollow interior. And he kept tapping until the bung was seated flush with the top of the hole and the muslin was compressed into a thin, even ring. A layer of beeswax was applied over the bung and around the joint, a thicker coating than on the canisters, and the refiner worked the wax with the stick until it formed a smooth, continuous dome that would keep out moisture and air. He moved through the remaining kegs one by one, filling and sealing each with the same careful, repetitive motions, the afternoon light shifting gradually from the bright, direct angle of midday to the softer, more golden slant of the late afternoon, and the pile of empty kegs in the corner diminished as the row of full, sealed kegs grew longer along the wall. The refiner's movements were slow and steady, his energy conserved with an almost economical precision, and he paused only to wipe his hands on a rag or to take a sip of water from a tin cup that he kept on the windowsill, the water cool and plain and tasting faintly of the iron pump from which it had been drawn that morning. When all the kegs were filled and sealed, the refiner turned at last to the labeling, the final small task that would identify the contents and the origin of each container, and that would mark the completion of the batch. He retrieved the stack of paper labels from their drawer beneath the bench, the same labels he had been preparing during the bleaching days, each one printed with the name of the shed and the words "Pure Spermaceti Oil, Best Quality, Nantucket," in a modest serif typeface, and beneath the printed text a blank space where the date would be written by hand. The paste pot, with its thin, floury mixture, sat beside a small brush on the corner of the bench, and the refiner stirred the paste once with the brush handle to ensure it was smooth before he began. He took a label from the stack and laid it face down on a clean cloth, then dipped the brush into the paste and applied a thin, even coat to the back of the paper, working from the center outward with quick, smooth strokes that left no lumps or bare spots. The paste gave off a faint, starchy scent that reminded him, in a distant, wordless way, of the small kitchen in his own house, where bread was made. A clean, homely smell that he had always found agreeable. He lifted the label carefully by its edges, carried it to the first tin canister on the tray, and pressed it onto the side of the canister, smoothing it down with his fingertips from the center outward so that the paper lay flat and without wrinkles, adhering firmly to the tin. He reached for a pencil that was kept sharpened to a fine point in a groove on the bench, and in the blank space beneath the printed text, he wrote the day's date in small, neat numerals that leaned slightly to the right, the graphite leaving a dark, precise line against the pale paper. The dates recorded not the day of the oil's arrival, or the day of its bleaching, but the day of its completion, and it was the last mark the refiner would make on this batch, a small, personal signature that asked for no attention but served its quiet purpose. He repeated the labeling on every canister, then moved to the kegs where the labels were larger and required more paste and more careful positioning, because the curved surface of the staves could cause the paper to buckle if it was not applied correctly. The refiner worked slowly, his fingers spreading the paste and smoothing the paper with the same gentle, patient touch he had used throughout the entire refining. And when he was finished, every container in the shed bore its proper label, the words Nantucket repeated in a neat, orderly column that told a sign and story of origin and quality to anyone who would later read them. The filled and labeled canisters and kegs were arranged in two distinct groups, the canisters on their tray near the door, ready to be carried to the lighthouse tender that would arrive the next day, and the kegs lined up against the wall in a single, straight row, their dark wooden sides stamped with the pale rectangles of the labels and sealed with the golden domes of beeswax. The refiner stepped back and looked at the collection with the same quiet, neutral attention he had given to every other stage of the work, his eyes moving slowly across the rows, registering the symmetry and the order, the clean lines and the even spacing. There was no pride in his gaze, only a simple recognition that the work was done, that the oil that had arrived as a dark, foul-smelling sludge had been transformed into a clear, pure fuel that would burn through the long, dark hours ahead, and that his part in the transformation was now complete. He swept the floor one last time, gathering the stray bits of cork and the odd smear of wax that had fallen during the sealing, and he washed the paste pot and the brush and the brass funnel and the flask in the bucket of water by the door, the water growing faintly cloudy with the residue of paste and oil. The tools were dried and hung in their places. The rags were gathered and set aside for washing, and the stove was banked with a fresh log that would burn slowly through the evening and into the early hours of the morning, keeping the shed warm for the next day's work, whatever that work might be. The window, still open a crack at the top, let in the cool, salt-tinged air of the late afternoon, and the refiner stood beside the bench with his hands resting on its edge, his breathing slow and even, his body still but not tense, a man at rest in the middle of a space that he had shaped, over many years, into a vessel of quiet productivity. Outside, the sounds of the waterfront had begun their gradual winding down, the carts no longer creaking on the sand, and the voices of the labourers fading into the distance as the day drew toward its close, and the light through the window had deepened into a warm amber tone that seemed to echo the colour of the oil in its earlier stages, a gentle reminder of the long journey the liquid had undertaken from the dark, crude beginning to the clear end. The refiner turned his head to look once more at the rows of containers, their labels glowing softly in the low light, and then he reached for his wool waistcoat, which hung from a peg beside the door, shrugging it on with the same unhurried ease that had accompanied every gesture of the day, and he let himself out into the cool, foggy evening, the door closing behind him with a soft, firm click that left the shed in its own peaceful silence, the oil sealed and labelled and warning that would carry it away. The evening that followed the labelling and sealing was a quiet one, the kind of evening that settled over Nantucket in the spring, with a slow, gradual dimming of the light and a cooling of the air that came in soft, salt-laden breaths from the harbour. The refiner had closed the shed with his usual care, the wooden shutter latched over the window, the stove door checked and the vent adjusted, the floor swept clean of the day's small debris, and the door pulled shut and secured with the iron latch that had grown smooth under decades of handling. The canisters and kegs remained inside in their orderly rows, the pale labels just visible in the faint glow from the stove's air vent, and the shed itself seemed to settle around them with a quiet, protective stillness, as if it understood the value of the clear, clean liquid that was now ready to depart. The refiner walked the short path back toward the town, his boots making soft, familiar sounds on the packed sand, and he did not look back, because there was no need to look back when the work was done and the shed was secure and the night was coming on with its own gentle, inevitable rhythm. The next morning brought a change in the routine, a small departure from the pattern of the past weeks that the refiner accepted with the same evenness that he accepted everything else. A cart arrived not long after first light, A different cart from the one that had brought the crude oil, this one lighter and smaller, drawn by a single grey horse whose mane was braided with a few faded ribbons. A small touch of decoration that spoke of a driver who took pride in his animal. The driver, a man the refiner had known for many years without ever learning much about, stepped down from the bench and exchanged a few quiet words about the tide and the weather. The kind of exchange that was more a ritual of acknowledgement than a conversation. Together they carried the tray of tin canisters from the shelf to the cart, the refiner holding the tray level and steady while the driver lifted each canister and nestled it into a padded wooden crate that had been built specifically for this purpose. Its interior divided into compartments lined with straw to cushion the vessels during the journey over the rough, sandy roads. The canisters clinked softly as they were settled into place, a gentle musical sound that was both ordinary and satisfying, and when all 24 had been loaded, the driver closed the crate's lid and secured it with a leather strap, tipping his cap to the refiner before climbing back onto the bench and urging the grey horse forward with a soft click of his tongue. The kegs, being heavier and destined for a different destination, were loaded onto a second cart that came later in the morning, this one drawn by 2 sturdy brown horses and driven by a pair of labourers from the wharf. The men rolled the kegs out of the shed one by one, tilting them onto their rims and guiding them along the boardwalk with the same careful, practiced movements that the earlier delivery men had used weeks before, and they hoisted them into the cart bed, where they were lashed upright with thick ropes and covered with a heavy canvas cloth to protect them from the salt spray of the sea journey ahead. The refiner stood by the door and watched the loading without directing or interfering, his hands tucked into the pockets of his waistcoat. His presence simply a quiet assurance that the work had been done correctly and that the oil inside the kegs would perform as expected. When the last keg was secure and the canvas was tied down with neat sailorly knots, the labourers took their places on the cart and the horses leaned into their harnesses and the whole load creaked away toward the wharf. The sound of the wheels on the sand growing fainter and fainter until it merged with the general, distant hum of the waterfront and was gone. The shed felt different after the oil had been taken away, lighter and emptier, though the emptiness was not a sad one, but rather the clean, open emptiness of a room that had fulfilled its purpose and was now resting between tasks. The refiners spent a short while inside, wiping down the bench and checking the stove, and making sure that the scrap bucket had been emptied and the tools were all in their places. And then he too left, closing the door behind him and walking away from the waterfront with the slow, measured stride of a man who had no urgent business anywhere. And if the shed felt empty, it was an emptiness that would not last, because in a week or two another cask of crude oil would arrive from the try-works and the whole long, patient cycle would begin again. The settling and the filtering and the heating and the bleaching and the pleaching and the ploshing and the testing, each step following the last in a quiet, unbroken circle that turned with the seasons and the tides and the needs of the lighthouses that stood guard along the dark, rocky coast. The canisters that had been loaded onto the first cart were bound for the lighthouse at Sankati Head, a tall brick tower that rose from the bluffs on the eastern shore of the island, where the Atlantic Ocean stretched away into an endless, heaving grey, and the winds blew hard enough to make a man lean into them as he walked. The cart made its way across the island over roads that were little more than sandy tracks winding through the low, scrubby vegetation, the grey horse moving with a patient, steady plod that ate up the miles without hurry, and the driver sat on his bench with the reins loose in his hands, humming a tune that had no name and no particular beginning or end. By the time the cart reached the lighthouse, the afternoon light had begun to slant toward the west, and the tower cast a long, slender shadow across the grass that rippled in the wind like a dark, silent river. The keeper, a man who lived in the small stone cottage attached to the base of the tower, came out to meet the cart and helped to carry the crate of canisters inside, his movements economical and sure, his face weathered by sun and salt to a texture like old leather. He opened the crate and lifted out one of the canisters, reading the label with a brief, approving nod, and then he carried it up the winding iron staircase that spiraled around the inside of the tower, the stairs ringing faintly under his boots, the walls curving upward into a darkness that grew lighter as he climbed toward the lantern room at the top. The lantern room at the top of the Sankati Head lighthouse was a circular chamber walled with glass on all sides, its windows looking out over the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic. and in the center of the room stood the great argand lamp, a massive brass apparatus fitted with multiple concentric wicks and a complex arrangement of mirrors and lenses that gathered the light and shaped it into a beam that could be seen for miles across the open water. The keeper set the canister on a small shelf beside the lamp, uncorked it, and poured a portion of the clear, pale oil into the lamp's reservoir, the liquid flowing with a smooth, silent ease that spoke of its purity, and the scent that rose from it was so faint and clean that it was lost immediately in the salt air that blew through the ventilators. The wicks, which had been trimmed that morning, soaked up the oil with a thirsty readiness, their white cotton darkening to grey and then to translucent amber as the capillary action drew the fuel upward to the flame. When the evening came and the light began to fail, the keeper would return to the lantern room with his flint at his slow match, and he would touch the flame to the wicks and watch them bloom into the steady white-gold glow that would sweep across the dark water all through the night. A beam that sailors would see from their decks and use to steer by, a beam that was, in part, the quiet gift of a man who had spent his days in a small wooden shed, stirring and watting with an attention that asked for nothing in return. Not all of the oil went to the lighthouses. The kegs that had been loaded onto the second cart were destined for a different kind of journey, a longer one that would take them across the water to the mainland and into the streets of the growing cities where the whale oil street lamps were lit every evening by men who climbed tall ladders with small flames cupped in their hands. The kegs were carried to the wharf and loaded onto a coastal schooner, a two-masted vessel with a hull painted a dark weathered green and sails that had been patched so many times they looked like a map of small overlapping continents. The crew stowed the kegs in the hold, packing them in tight with other cargo, barrels of salt fish and bundles of wool and crates of iron fittings, and the schooner sailed on the morning tide, slipping out of the harbor with the same quiet ease that the oil itself had slipped through the felt and the fuller's earth. The voyage to the mainland took the better part of a day, the schooner moving through the grey choppy water with its sails bellied out in the steady wind, and the kegs in the hold rocked gently with the motion of the sea, their contents undisturbed and their seals holding firm. When the schooner docked at the wharf in Boston, the kegs were unloaded by stevedores who worked with a brisk, practiced efficiency, their hooks and ropes and shouts, a different kind of rhythm from the quiet patience of the shed, a rhythm that belonged to the city rather than the island. The kegs were carried to a warehouse near the harbor, a long, low building with a timber roof and a floor of packed earth, where they were stored alongside other barrels of oil from other refiners, their labels marking them as the product of a particular shed, a particular man, a particular island that most of the city dwellers would never see. From the warehouse, the oil would be distributed to the lamplighters, men who pushed small carts through the streets in the late afternoon, their carts loaded with cans of oil and bundles of wicks and long poles with small hooks at the end. And as dusk began to fall over the city, they would make their rounds, stopping at each iron lamppost to lower the lamp, fill its reservoir, trim its wick, and touch a flame to the cotton, and the street would bloom into a row of soft, steady lights that pushed back the darkness and made the street safe for the night. The light that shone from those street lamps was the same light that had passed through the wool, felt in the quiet shed, the same light that had basked for days in the pale Nantucket sun, the same light that had dripped through the fuller's earth and the charcoal and emerged as clear as winter water, and it burned now in the city streets with the same clean, unwavering steadiness that the refiner had confirmed in his small glass cup on his stone slab workbench. The people who walked beneath those lamps, the merchants and the laborers and the mothers with their children, did not think about where the light came from or what had been required to make it, and the refiner did not expect them to, because the light itself was the point, the simple, ordinary miracle of illumination that pushed back the darkness and allowed life to continue after the sun had gone. Back on Nantucket, the refiner had finished his day and was walking home along the sandy path that led from the waterfront into the town, the evening fog beginning to gather in low, soft banks that muted the sounds of the harbor and blurred the edges of the buildings. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of the sea and the faint, distant scent of wood smoke from the chimneys of the houses, and the sky above had faded from pale grey to a deeper, softer shade that was not yet dark, but no longer light. The refiner walked with his hands in his pockets and his collar turned up against the chill, his pace slow and steady, his mind as quiet as the evening around him. He passed the chandlery and the sailmaker's loft, their windows dark and their doors closed, and he passed the small, whitewashed houses with their lamplit windows that glowed with a warm yellow light, the same light that filled his own small house when he opened the door and stepped inside, hanging his waistcoat on its peg, and settling into the chair by the cold hearth with the same quiet, unhurried ease that had carried him through every moment of the long, patient work. The shed, dark and still now, sat by the waterfront with its row of empty pans and its clean copper kettle and its stack of wool felt, waiting for the next cask and the next batch, and the next slow, steady transformation, and the oil that had passed through its door and through the refiner's hands was already burning. Somewhere out in the wide, dark world, a small, steady flame that asked for nothing but to be given its chance to shine.